May 15, 1992, Palmetto Grove, Florida. The humidity clung to everything that night in Palmetto Grove, a sleepy coastal town where Spanish moss draped the oak trees like forgotten curtains and the Gulf breeze carried the salt-sweet scent of mangroves. Emily Carter pushed through the glass doors of Gulfview Community College's library, her arms full of psychology textbooks and her mind focused on the final exam that would determine her sophomore year fate. At 19, Emily was everything Palmetto Grove expected from its young people: polite, hard-working, and quietly ambitious. She had sun-bleached hair that caught the light just right, freckles across her nose from childhood summers on the bay, and a laugh that could cut through the thickest Florida heat. Her parents, Robert and Margaret Carter, ran the town's only hardware store, and Emily worked weekends organizing inventory while dreaming of becoming a child psychologist. The fluorescent lights of the library buzzed overhead as Emily settled into her usual spot by the window overlooking the campus parking lot. Outside, palm fronds swayed in the warm evening breeze, and she could hear the distant sound of cicadas beginning their nightly chorus. Her boyfriend, Derek Winslow, had promised to pick her up at closing time, 11 p.m., in his forest green 1991 Jeep Cherokee, the one with the slightly dented bumper and the key fob that never worked quite right. Derek was 3 years older, a local boy whose family owned Winslow Marina on the bay. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up around boats and tourists, with calloused hands and sun-streaked brown hair. Emily's parents weren't entirely sold on him. They thought he lacked direction. Drifting between odd jobs at the marina and community college classes he rarely finished. But Emily saw something different in Derek, a restlessness she understood, a desire to be more than what Palmetto Grove expected. As the hours passed, Emily's highlighter moved steadily across pages about cognitive development and behavioral patterns. The library slowly emptied around her, until only she and Mrs. Henderson, the night librarian, remained. The old woman moved quietly between the stacks, reshelving books and preparing to lock up. At 10:45 p.m., Emily gathered her materials, checking her watch and wondering if Derek was already waiting outside. She stepped into the parking lot and felt the night air wrap around her like a warm blanket. The asphalt still radiated heat from the day, and the smell of jasmine drifted from the landscaping around the science building, but Derek's Jeep was nowhere to be seen. Emily walked to the edge of the lot, her sandals clicking against the pavement, and peered down the street. Nothing. 15 minutes later, with Mrs. Henderson's keys jingling as she locked the library doors, Emily made a decision that would haunt Palmetto Grove for decades. Rather than wait or call her parents, she decided to walk the half-mile to the marina. It wasn't unusual. She'd done it before when Derek got caught up with boat repairs or lost track of time. The route took her down Oleander Street, past the old oak trees and colonial-style houses, then along Bay Road where the pavement gave way to crushed shell and the air grew thick with salt. The last person to see Emily Carter alive was Tommy Hernandez, a shrimper heading home from Murphy's Tavern around 11:30 p.m. He later told police he saw a young woman walking alone on Bay Road, her blonde hair visible in his truck's headlights. She was carrying a backpack and moving with purpose toward the water. Tommy didn't stop, and in Palmetto Grove, people walked at night all the time. It was that kind of place, where everyone knew everyone and trouble was something that happened in bigger cities. By midnight, Emily had vanished into the humid darkness of the Florida night, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. May 16, 1992, Dawn Margaret Carter knew something was wrong before the sun fully rose over Palmetto Grove. Emily always called when she was going to be late, always left notes, always kept her promises. When Derek Winslow showed up at Carter's Hardware at 7 a.m., his face pale and his hands shaking as he asked if Emily had made it home, Margaret felt her world begin to tilt. She never showed up at the library, Derek explained, his voice barely above a whisper. I waited until almost midnight, but she wasn't there. I thought maybe she'd gotten a ride with someone else. Robert Carter closed the hardware store and drove straight to the sheriff's office, his wife clutching Emily's senior portrait so hard her knuckles went white. Sheriff Bill Connolly, a heavy-set man who'd known the Carter family for 20 years, took the report seriously but followed protocol. Emily was 19, an adult, and it had only been 8 hours since she was last seen. People sometimes stayed out all night, he explained gently, college students especially. But by that afternoon, when Emily failed to show up for her shift at the hardware store, the entire town mobilized. Word spread through Palmetto Grove the way it always did in small towns, through whispered conversations at the post office, concerned phone calls between neighbors, and the kind of instinctive understanding that something precious had been lost. The search began that evening. Volunteers gathered at the community center on Main Street, their faces grim in the fluorescent light. Sheriff's deputies organized search parties, while local boat owners prepared to comb the bay and its countless inlets. The Coast Guard was notified, and by nightfall spotlights were sweeping the water from Palmetto Point to the Old Bay Bridge. Derek Winslow was questioned extensively. He sat in the sheriff's office for 3 hours, his story never changing. He'd fallen asleep at the marina after working late on an engine repair, woke up around 11:45 p.m., and drove to the library to find it dark and empty. He'd waited in the parking lot until midnight, then drove around town looking for Emily before finally giving up and going home. His father, Carl Winslow, confirmed that Derek's Jeep was at the marina that evening. He'd seen it parked by the boat slips when he'd locked up the office around 9 p.m. The searches continued for 2 weeks. Volunteers walked every street, checked every abandoned building, and knocked on every door in Palmetto Grove and the surrounding area. Divers explored the murky waters around the marina, and search dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere. Flyers with Emily's smiling face appeared on telephone poles and shop windows throughout the county, but as May turned to June, the daily search parties grew smaller. People had jobs to return to, lives to resume. The initial burst of community energy that had sustained the search began to fade into a quieter, more persistent worry. Margaret Carter aged years in those first weeks, her hair showing grey streaks that hadn't been there before. Robert Carter threw himself into the search with an intensity that worried his friends, spending entire days walking the same stretches of shoreline over and over. The theories began almost immediately. Some believed Emily had been the victim of a random crime, perhaps someone passing through town who'd seen a young woman walking alone and seized an opportunity. Others whispered about the transient workers who came through during shrimp season, men who knew the waterways and might know how to make someone disappear. A few pointed fingers at Derek, noting his family's access to boats and his intimate knowledge of every hidden cove and inlet in the area. Derek himself seemed to retreat into a shell of guilt and confusion. He stopped coming around the hardware store, avoided the places where he and Emily had spent time together, and threw himself into work at the marina with an obsession that concerned his parents. When questioned again by deputies, he broke down crying, insisting that he loved Emily and would never hurt her. The investigation found no evidence linking him to her disappearance, no witnesses placing him anywhere but the marina that night. By July dawn, the official search had largely ended. The case remained open, but Sheriff Connolly had to acknowledge what everyone in Palmetto Grove feared. Emily Carter had vanished without a trace. The town settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that comes when a community realizes that not all mysteries have solutions. The Carter family's grief became a public thing, played out in the sympathetic glances at the grocery store and the way conversations stopped when Margaret walked into a room. Robert Carter hired a private investigator from Tampa, a former police detective named Ray Morrison who specialized in missing persons cases. Morrison spent 3 months in Palmetto Grove, interviewing residents and following leads that invariably led nowhere. By the end of summer, even Morrison had to admit defeat. Emily Carter had simply walked into the humid Florida night and disappeared, leaving behind a grieving family and a town that would never quite feel safe again. The missing person posters began to fade in the subtropical sun, their edges curling and their colors bleaching away, but Emily's absence remained as real and heavy as the humid air that never seemed to lift from Palmetto Grove. July 10, 1992, Palmetto Point. The summer storm had been violent but brief, the kind that rolled in from the Gulf with little warning and left the air even thicker than before. By dawn, the wind had died and the rain had stopped, but the storm surge had pushed debris far up onto the beaches and into the mangrove thickets that lined the bay. Charlie Reeves was 62 years old and had been beachcombing along Palmetto Point for most of his adult life. A retired postal worker with weathered hands and endless patience, he knew every shell, every piece of driftwood, and every scrap of interesting junk that the tide could deliver. That morning, he picked his way carefully through the storm debris, his metal detector sweeping back and forth across the wet sand. It was just after 8 a.m. when he spotted it, a blue and grey backpack tangled in the roots of a mangrove tree about 50 yards from the normal high tide line. The storm surge had pushed it far inland, into a thicket that most people would never think to explore. Charlie waded through ankle-deep water and carefully extracted the bag from the twisted roots. The fabric was waterlogged and stained, but the heavy canvas had protected most of the contents. Charlie's hands shook as he unzipped the main compartment and saw textbooks, notebooks with careful handwriting, and a student ID card in a plastic sleeve. The photo showed a young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile. The name read, Emily Carter, Gulfview Community College. Charlie Reeves had lived in Palmetto Grove his entire life. He remembered the searches, the flyers, the way the whole town had held its breath for weeks waiting for news about the missing girl. He also knew he was holding the first real clue in Emily Carter's disappearance. Within an hour, Sheriff Connolly was standing in the mangroves with Charlie, carefully cataloguing the backpack's contents. Inside were Emily's psychology textbooks, 3 spiral notebooks filled with class notes, a calculator, pens, highlighters, and a small makeup bag. Everything looked exactly like what a college student would carry to a late-night study session at the library, but there were also things that told a different story. The backpack's exterior showed signs of prolonged submersion, not just from the storm surge, but from having been in salt water for weeks. Marine growth clung to the zippers, and the fabric had the distinctive bleaching that came from extended exposure to sun and seawater. Most telling of all was the pattern of debris caught in the straps, bits of seaweed and small shells that suggested the bag had been tumbling along the bay bottom before washing up on shore. The discovery reinvigorated the investigation. Sheriff Connolly called in marine experts to study the tides and currents, trying to determine where Emily's backpack might have originally entered the water. The most likely scenario placed the entry point somewhere near the Old Bay Bridge or the deeper waters around Winslow Marina. Derek Winslow was brought in for another round of questioning. The discovery of Emily's backpack, clearly having spent weeks underwater, supported his story about never meeting her at the library that night, but it also raised new questions. How had Emily's backpack ended up in the bay? Had she fallen in somewhere? Been pushed? The bag's condition suggested it had been submerged for most of the time since her disappearance, but that only deepened the mystery of what had happened to Emily herself. The town buzzed with renewed energy and fresh theories. Some saw the backpack as proof that Emily had drowned, perhaps walking too close to the water in the dark and slipping into the bay. Others viewed it as evidence of foul play, suggesting someone had disposed of her belongings to cover their tracks. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the discovery, and Emily's case briefly returned to the regional news. Margaret and Robert Carter examined their daughter's recovered belongings with hands that trembled. The notebooks were filled with Emily's familiar handwriting, her careful study guides and margin notes about childhood development theories. Her favorite pen was still clipped inside the spiral binding of her psychology notebook, but seeing these intimate pieces of Emily's daily life, water-stained and salt-crusted, only made her absence more painful. The investigation that followed the backpack's discovery lasted through the rest of the summer, but ultimately led nowhere new. The marine experts confirmed that the bag could have entered the water at dozens of different locations, and the currents in the bay were too complex to pinpoint a specific origin. Divers searched the areas deemed most likely, but found no trace of Emily herself. As 1992 turned into 1993, and 1993 faded into 1994, Emily Carter's case gradually shifted from an active investigation to a cold case file. The backpack discovery had provided a tantalizing clue, but like everything else connected to Emily's disappearance, it raised more questions than it answered. The bag sat in evidence storage at the sheriff's office, a water-stained reminder that somewhere in Palmetto Grove's peaceful facade lay the answer to what had happened to a 19-year-old girl who had simply wanted to study late at the library and walk home through the humid Florida night. March 15, 2025, 33 years later, Detective Alicia Monroe had seen plenty of cold cases during her 15 years with the Palmetto County Sheriff's Office, but she'd never expected to be standing in a mangrove swamp holding human remains that would reopen the town's most haunting mystery. The call had come from Jake Patterson, a marine biologist conducting a water quality study near the Old Bay Bridge. What he'd found tangled in the ancient root system of a massive red mangrove would shatter Palmetto Grove's long-held assumptions about Emily Carter's fate. The remains were remarkably well preserved, protected by the brackish water and acidic conditions of the mangrove ecosystem. Along with the bones, Patterson had discovered a tarnished charm bracelet and a broken plastic key fob that still bore the faded Jeep logo. Detective Monroe, who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the missing college girl, immediately recognized the significance of what they'd found. The DNA confirmation took 2 weeks. Emily Carter's dental records, preserved in her family dentist's files, provided additional verification, but it was the charm bracelet that made Margaret Carter weep when Detective Monroe showed it to her in the nursing home in Tallahassee, where she now lived. The engraving was barely visible after 3 decades underwater. E.C. plus D.W. Derek Winslow was 55 now, a successful real estate agent who'd married, divorced, and built a comfortable life selling waterfront properties to retirees and vacation home buyers. He'd never left Palmetto Grove, despite the whispers that had followed him for years. When Detective Monroe knocked on his door that Tuesday morning, Derek's face went pale, but he didn't seem surprised. "I wondered when this day would come," he said quietly, inviting her inside his modest ranch house overlooking the bay. The confession didn't come all at once. It emerged slowly, piece by piece, over several interviews at the sheriff's office. Derek's former college roommate, Tom Bradley, had provided the crucial break in the case. Now a successful attorney in Jacksonville, Bradley had carried the weight of Derek's secret for over 3 decades. In a phone call to Detective Monroe, he'd finally revealed what Derek had told him in the weeks after Emily's disappearance. "Derek came back to our dorm that night around 2 a.m., Bradley explained. "He was soaking wet and shaking. He said there'd been a terrible accident, that Emily had slipped and fallen into the water near the marina, and that he couldn't save her. He made me promise never to tell anyone." When confronted with Bradley's statement, Derek's composure finally cracked. In the stark interview room where so many confessions had been heard over the years, he told Detective Monroe what had really happened on May 15, 1992. He had been at the marina that night, but not sleeping as he'd claimed. He'd been drinking beer and working on an engine repair, losing track of time until he realized Emily was probably waiting at the library. By the time he got there, the building was dark and locked. Panicking, he'd driven to places where he thought Emily might have gone, finally spotting her walking along Bay Road toward the marina. "She was angry," Derek said, his voice barely audible. "Really angry. She said I was unreliable, that she was tired of always being disappointed. We started arguing right there on the dock behind my dad's office. Emily said maybe we should break up, that she deserved better than someone who couldn't even remember to pick her up." The argument had escalated quickly. Derek, defensive and still affected by the beer he'd consumed, had grabbed Emily's arm when she tried to walk away. In the struggle that followed, Emily had lost her footing on the wet dock and fallen backward into the dark water of the bay. The tide was going out, and the current was stronger than usual due to the recent storms. "She went under so fast," Derek whispered. "I jumped in after her, but the water was black and I couldn't see anything. I dove down over and over, but I couldn't find her. By the time I gave up, I was exhausted and hypothermic. I knew she was gone." Derek had spent the rest of that night in a state of shock, eventually retrieving Emily's backpack from the dock and throwing it into the bay, hoping it would sink and disappear forever. He'd driven home, showered, and tried to convince himself it had all been a terrible dream. But when Emily's father came to the marina the next morning asking questions, Derek realized there was no going back. "I wanted to tell the truth," Derek said. "But I was scared. I thought nobody would believe it was an accident. I thought they'd blame me for drinking, for grabbing her arm. So I lied about sleeping at the marina, and the lie just got bigger and bigger until I couldn't take it back." The medical examiner's report confirmed that Emily's remains were consistent with drowning, and the location where she was found supported Derek's account of the accident. There were no signs of trauma beyond what would be expected from 3 decades in a marine environment, but the truth didn't bring the closure that Palmetto Grove had hoped for. Derek Winslow was charged with involuntary manslaughter and filing false police reports, but given his cooperation and the passage of time, he received a suspended sentence and probation. The legal resolution felt anticlimactic after 33 years of mystery and speculation. Margaret Carter, now 73 and suffering from early-stage dementia, struggled to process the news. Her daughter hadn't been murdered by a stranger or kidnapped by transients. She had died in a moment of anger and poor judgment, an accident that might have been prevented if a young man had been braver about telling the truth. The memorial service was held on a humid Saturday in April, with half the town gathered at Palmetto Grove Community Church. Emily's remains were buried in the cemetery behind the church, not far from where her father Robert had been laid to rest 5 years earlier. Margaret Carter, supported by relatives who had driven down from Georgia, placed the recovered charm bracelet in a small box that was buried with her daughter. In her brief remarks to the gathered crowd, Margaret's words were quiet but clear. Sometimes the truth doesn't free you. It just tells you what you feared all along. The bay carried away the flowers that people dropped from the old bridge later that afternoon, and with them, perhaps, some of the weight that Palmetto Grove had carried for over 3 decades. Derek Winslow left town the day after the memorial service. He sold his house and his business and moved to somewhere in North Carolina, according to the rumors. Detective Monroe's final report noted that while the Emily Carter case was officially closed, questions would always remain about those crucial moments on the dock that night in 1992 and whether the full truth had finally been told. The only certainty was that Emily Carter could finally rest and Palmetto Grove could begin to heal from a wound that had never quite stopped bleeding. But healing, like the truth, would take time, and some scars would always remain visible in the humid air that never quite lifted from the sleepy coastal town where Spanish moss still draped the oak trees like forgotten curtains.